So, in this video I would like to give you a semi-virtual tour of my studio setup as it was in the 1990s. Now, I love watching studio tours on YouTube. I love to see the gear that musicians and composers have and how they use them. So I hope you do too, and I hope you will find this interesting. Now, I call it a semi-virtual tour because at the time I didn't take any videos of my setup, I didn't take any photographs. So what I'm going to do is just show you pictures of the gear and describe what it was and what it did and how I used it. The first thing to say, if you have been watching any of the other videos on this channel where I describe my little bedroom studio as it was back in the 1980s, a card should pop up here if you want to check that out, and there will also be a link in the description. Now, the first thing I want to say about this is I had nothing in my studio in the 1990s that I had in the 1980s. I sold my Roland 100M and the Space Echo. I sold my Alka organ. Now, when I tell people now that I had a Roland 100M system and sold it, I can see and hear gasps of dismay. I sold it sometime in the 1980s. MIDI had been announced and I knew that the writing was on the wall for analog gear. Prior to MIDI, there was a massive connectivity problem. If you wanted to use equipment from different manufacturers, they all used slightly different standards. So it wasn't always easy to connect a piece of Yamaha and Roland gear, sequential gear, whatever. It wasn't easy to connect these things together. So the Roland 100M system didn't have MIDI, so I thought this is just going to go the way of the dinosaur. Now, I don't regret selling it at all. It was a brilliant piece of equipment, but my synthesizer requirements over that period of time changed. I was a gigging keyboard player, and what I needed was an instrument which would make me sound like a band. So I needed pianos and strings and brass and guitars and stuff like that. More to the point, I needed something that was polyphonic, and I also needed something with presets so I could quickly change settings on the fly during a live performance. I could see we were getting close to this in the 1980s with the development of digital technology and digital synthesizers. I won't bore you with my thought processes as I raffle over the various bits of gear that Yamaha and Roland and Korg and other companies were bringing out, but suffice to say that in 1989 Yamaha released the SY77, and that for me ticked all the boxes. Now, I do intend to make another video about the Yamaha SY77, so in brief I will just say it was a polyphonic synthesizer, it was digital, it was based on FM synthesis, FM frequency modulation, which was pioneered in Yamaha's DX7 a few years earlier, but it also added ROM-based samples, so the sonic palette of the SY77 was far greater than the DX7, and it could create a lot of more organic and even analogish type sounds. On top of that, it had proper push buttons instead of the membrane buttons on the DX7, and it was multi-timbral. It was 16-part multi-timbral. So if you had a 16-track sequencer, you could plug this in and play 16 different sounds at the same time. So this was at the heart of my little studio from 1989, 1990 onwards. And I don't think there's a piece of music that I recorded during that time, very few pieces, which did not include the SY77 in some capacity. Now, with the advent of MIDI, it became possible to control one synthesizer from another one, which led to the question, why do you need more than one keyboard? Well, if you are Rick Wakeman, you need a lot of keyboards, and preferably more than two hands. It's still wonderful to have a collection of synths which have their own keyboard. However, the ability to control one synth from another synth, along with the development of MIDI-based sequencers, led to the development of rack-based synthesizers. Now, these were essentially synthesizers in a 19-inch rack format, typically just 1U, some were 2U, some were 3U. And you could plug a MIDI keyboard into these or another synthesizer and play away, or you could feed them information from a MIDI sequencer. So you didn't need to spend extra money on a keyboard. However, because of the small form factor, they had a limited amount of space for controls. So the selection of presets and any form of editing required a fair amount of menu diving. Now, the popularity of rack-based synths seems to have been fading recently in favour of the desktop module, which gives you the synthesizer engine in a box but without the keyboard, but with the controls and the knobs which you would need to control the synth. In my opinion, that's a much better solution. So, as well as my SY77, I had a few rack-based synths. I had a Yamaha TX81Z, which was the rack-based equivalent of the DX11. This also used FM synthesis, but the great thing about this was that instead of simple sine waves, which the original DX7 used, it added additional waveforms to the FM process, so it could get a greater range of sounds. It was a super little unit, and I think it is still quite popular today. The other rack-based synth I had was the Kawai K1. Now, at the time, Kawai actually produced a few synthesizers. A lot later on, I think it got out of the synth business. It still produces pianos, for example, which I think was a shame because it actually had some really good products. The Kawai K1 and the Kawai K4 were alternatives, if you like, to Roland's D50 LA synthesis system. So the K1 and the K4 could produce very D50-ish sounds, and it was a unit which I really liked. Now, in the late 1990s, I was approached by a film producer who asked if I would be interested in scoring a project he was working on. When you think of a film producer, you might think of someone who produces Hollywood blockbusters, but he wasn't one of them. I think there are probably dozens, if not hundreds, of small independent movie production outfits who produce movies for TV, and this guy, I can't remember exactly what he did, but I think he produced a lot of shorts, 20-30 minute shorts, documentaries, wildlife movies and so on. Now, I met him briefly in London to discuss the project. I can't actually remember what the project was, but whatever it was, I would certainly be interested in writing music for it. But he said he was very open, very upfront. He said, look, I can't guarantee at all that this project is going to come off. He said at any one time he was probably juggling 50 or 60 projects, and he admitted that the majority didn't come to fruition. This was going to be a 20-minute movie, and he was quite apologetic when he said the budget would only allow about $3,000 for the music score. However, the project did not materialise, which was very sad, but on the strength of it, it gave me the excuse to buy an Akai S1000 sampler. I'd always wanted one of these things, always wanted to play with it, experiment with it, because this had real sounds from real instruments and real environments. The S1000 was a 16-bit stereo sampler, and it was pretty much state-of-the-art at the time, and I had a lot of fun with it. However, like a lot of the gear at the time, there's a lot of menu diving, and if you compare the features on the S1000 to a computer-based sampling system, say the Native Instruments Contact Sample Player, you can see how far sample libraries have come. However, the S1000 was a very powerful sampler at the time, although I did severely underuse it. The other piece of rack gear I had was an Alesis QuadraVerb. Now this seems to have created a sort of cult status, and I know it's still a popular reverb to this day. Alesis did bring out a QuadraVerb 2. I didn't do the upgrade, but I thought the original reverb was absolutely fantastic, and I probably used it on most pieces that I recorded. Also in my rack I had a proper mixer, unlike the little passive mixer I was using back in the 1980s. This was a Mackie Mixer. I can't remember the model number. I do remember the bonny coloured knobs. It was a rack-based mixer, so it fitted in the rack alongside the other synthesizers, and obviously I used this to route the audio from all the synths and to add a little bit of reverb to those parts which needed it. And that was basically the sound side of my studio setup. The other major part of the studio, however, of course, was the computer or computers. Now, we'll start with the Atari ST, which was released in 1986. Now, if you lived through the era or know a little bit about the history of computers in music, you will know that the Atari ST was the first computer to include MIDI ports in its design. I think it's probably the only one that did that. Now, the history of the development of the Atari ST is fascinating in itself, but this is not a history lesson, so won't go into that. You can Google it if you want to. But I was really interested to know who came up with the idea of including MIDI sockets in a computer. Other musicians were obviously also interested in the answer to that question, and I found some interviews with people who worked at Atari at the time, but no one, believe it or not, was able to say who actually came up with the idea of including MIDI sockets. The best explanation I could find as to why they were there was that Atari wanted to cover all bases. So that's a little bit disappointing. It would be really nice to know the person who came up with the idea so we could give them an accolade of some description. But by including MIDI ports in the computer, it became the de facto music computer. And within a few years, software companies, software developers were writing music software for the Atari ST. Now, one of the first music programs on the ST that I used, I think it was written by Steinberg, who is still going strong today, and that was the Pro 24. The big breakthrough, if you like, in music software development was with Steinberg's Cubase. Now, I think it went through a few name changes during development or during release. I think Qbeat was one of the original names. I think there were copyright issues and they eventually decided on the name Cubase. However, the outstanding feature of Cubase was that it had a graphical interface, so you could drag parts around the screen. And of course, it's a lot easier to visualize music and arrange it if you can see what you're doing rather than just typing a series of numbers into a box. However, if you imagine the most basic computer-based sequencer which had 16 tracks or whatever, giving you the ability to record 16 lines of music and play them through a synthesizer, a multi-timbral synth such as the Yamaha SY77, or through several synthesizers. Compare this to recording a monophonic music line in real time and recording to an analog 4-track tape recorder. The leap in the power this gave you was phenomenal. It let you record music which would have been physically impossible to record in any other way, and a lot of famous musicians have gone on record saying that the Atari ST gave them the power to create music which they would have otherwise been unable to produce. Now, Cubase wasn't the only music software. A company called C-Lab also produced a piece of music software called Creator, and this worked very much along the same lines as Cubase. However, C-Lab added a quite sophisticated notation editor to the program, and that became C-Lab Notator. Cubase also added notation, but I think C-Lab got there first. Now, as a keyboard player who reads music, this was absolutely fantastic. Now, I can look at a score and see roughly how the music is going to go, how it's going to sound, and I can look at it vertically to see if 2 or more music lines are going to tie up with each other and sound right. So this was of massive interest to me, and C-Lab Notator became my MIDI sequencer of choice during that time. Now, through the 80s and the 90s, I did have a day job, and this was actually writing about computer and music software for computer and music magazines. So as well as the Atari ST, I also had other computers. These included the BBC microcomputer, which was probably my favourite home computer of all time. Although it wasn't really up to handling MIDI data and the like. However, Acorn came out with another computer called the Archimedes, and there was music software for this. Although the Archimedes and the music software didn't attain the same level of interest and popularity as the software on the Atari ST, with one notable exception, and that was a program called Sibelius, which you may recognize. It was a music notation program, and it was written completely in machine code, and it was blindingly fast, and a lot of musicians who were interested in scoring bought an Archimedes simply to run Sibelius. This has now been ported to other platforms, but that was essentially Archimedes' main claim to fame. However, moving into the 90s, we also saw the development of the PC, initially running DOS and then Windows 3.1 and then various versions after that. The Apple Macintosh was also gaining in popularity at the time, and I had an Apple Mac. I can't remember the model number, but I had a MIDI interface for that, and I reviewed Mac-based music software, and that was really interesting. Now, as the 90s developed, Cubase was ported to the Mac and to the PC, and Notator was also ported to the Mac and the PC. However, C-Lab went through a change of name to Emagic. I'm not sure if they bought the company or the company bought them, and this was initially still available on the Mac and the PC. However, Apple liked the software so much that they bought the company, and development on the PC version ceased, and the Mac version became Logic or Logic Pro, and that is the version that still continues in development today. Now, as the 90s progressed, the Atari ST was grown a little bit long in the tooth. PCs and Macs were getting to the point where they could handle digital audio, so I moved more to the PC than to the Mac. Although I was still writing about and reviewing music software on both platforms, but I eventually settled on Cubase, and has been my main MIDI-based sequencer and DAW. So that was essentially my music studio setup in the 90s. Now, I haven't yet mentioned one very important piece of equipment, and that was the DAT Recorder. And it is through the DAT that my rediscovered tapes were made and became available. If you would like to know more about the rediscovered tapes, there's a card should be popping up here, and there is a link in the description. But essentially, although we had all this fantastic equipment for making music, how did we record it? Now we would make an audio recording onto a computer hard disk and then copy that off onto a CD. So I created the music on a computer-based sequencer and recorded the output of that to DAT tapes, and that created a very clean digital copy of the audio. So that is essentially my studio back in the 90s. Now, as the 90s progressed and we moved into the 21st century, hardware became capable of recording, manipulating and playing back digital audio, and this gave rise to the DAW, the digital audio workstation, which we know and use today. At least you now know the equipment that I was using when I made a lot of the pieces on my rediscovered tapes, and I will be posting pieces that I recorded using the pieces in my new 1990s studio. So I hope you found this interesting. If you lived through the 80s and the 90s, if you have any memories about the gear that you used or the processes that you used to record music, I'd be really interested to hear them if you want to leave a comment down below. As ever, thank you so much for staying with me and watching this far. I do hope you found it useful and interesting. If you did, then please consider subscribing and ring the bell. Thank you, so you get informed of the new videos when I put them up, and feel free to click the big thumb, it all helps. So thank you again, and I will see you in the next one.